Hi, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Try a bit of a different setting here, or background. Normally, I have similar backgrounds as you might have noticed, but hopefully this background is a bit different, maybe a bit more exciting. Especially if you get bored of my videos, you can enjoy the background. So yes, Hirsch Sai here, reporting from Auckland, New Zealand. Today is actually it's just ticked over midnight, so today is Saturday, the 18th of April, 2026. And yes, in this talk video, well, before I get onto that, I think I need to apologize for I think talk video 101, even more comedy from my past. I know that exactly wasn't the best comedy, so you guys won't feel sorry for, but yeah, so if that wasn't exactly the best comedy, I do apologize. I'll try to do better next time, but hey, I guess that's all I could come up with at the time, but yeah, okay. Thank God I'm not a stand-up comedian or anything of that nature, right? But yes, in today's talk video, believe you me, there's heaps of oil. There really is heaps of oil. Yes, the Earth is a finite place. It is a finite place, but it's still a huge planet, especially compared to the size of a human being, or compared to the size of a person, or even compared to everyone in the world. The Earth really is a huge, huge place. And if you look at it, the vast majority of the population is really in Asia, isn't it? You look at China with a bit below 1.4 billion people, India with a bit above 1.4 billion people. I'm talking from April 2026. As of November 2022, the world population officially hit 8 billion, and India surpassed China as the most populous country in the world. It used to be China for a long time before that. But so India is a bit above 1.4 billion officially. China is a bit below 1.4 billion. But really, if you look at it, the vast majority of the people in the world are pretty much within Asia, especially when you consider those two countries. And I think Indonesia, if I'm correct, has a lot of people as well. But if you really look at a map of the world, a lot of it is quite empty and really sparsely populated. Not just the oceans, but you think about the deserts, you think about Antarctica, you think about the Australian desert, even a lot of places in Latin America. You think of Russia, for example. A lot of it is quite sparsely populated. But back to the topic, believe you me, there really is heaps of oil. We're always scaremongered into thinking that, oh, it's of limited supply and it's going to run out any day now. And, sometimes we hear things like I remember being a student at school in the late 90s, a teenager, and the teacher saying, oh, the oil will run out. Probably not in your lifetime, but certainly in your children's lifetime. That might still seem true. I do remember my own father who spent a lot of time working in energy and energy generation. He remembers back in 1977, around the time he first came to New Zealand, he remembers there was a report put out in 1977 in New Zealand, a very in-depth research report saying that the oil will run out in about 30 years' time. The oil will run out in about 30 years' time from 1977. So that takes us to 2007. 2007, which is now 19 years ago. 2007, which is now 19 years ago. I know someone who was born in 2007, and I spoke to her not long back, and she's 18 going on 19. But yeah, obviously that didn't happen. But, we're always scaremongered into thinking that the oil is going to run out because that's kind of what they want you to think. And really, the price of oil has almost nothing to do with the supply of oil. Ultimately, it does because if oil does run out or runs low, then the price goes up. Sure, but for the but for mostly the price of oil has nothing to do with the supply of oil. It's all politics. And of course, I thought this was a very good relevant video to post now because what's happening with the whole Iran war. Today is the 18th of April 2026. Maybe by the time you see this, the Iran war will hopefully be over, whether it's just 1 or 2 or 3 months down the track, or even if it's 6 months or 12 months down the track. Hopefully, this horrible, meaningless war by a stupid, idiotic president, hopefully this war will be over. But really, it's usually political. It's political, like wars such as this, like the Iraq War, like the Gulf War, and of course what happened with OPEC with the oil shocks in 1973 and 1979 when they colluded together to produce a cartel and together act like a monopoly and therefore bump up the price. If I'm correct, in 1973 the price went up by 4 times overnight. And of course, the demand for oil is very inelastic, meaning that even as the price increases, even if it goes up immensely, the demand doesn't really change by much or doesn't go down by much as you would expect it to because people need oil. They need to get from A to B. They need to commute. They need to drive. But really, the price of oil has almost nothing to do with the supply of oil. Now, coming back to the topic of this talk video, believe you me, there's heaps of oil. There really is. In the Middle East, it's amazing. In the year 2026, we're still so heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, but there is a lot of oil throughout the Sahara Desert, which used to be lush and green. As you know, where does oil come from? Oil is basically dead animal and plant from millions of years ago. Sometimes we hear about it as being dead dinosaurs. It's mostly dead plants or dead vegetation, as vegetation and bodies of animals, decay and they sink into the earth and they decay, but there's energy stored in that matter. It gets squashed, it becomes peat, which is a solid, and then eventually turns into fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and gas. Basically, the three fossil fuels in the three forms: oil in liquid form, coal in solid form, and gas in gas form. The three basic states of matter, aren't they? Solid, liquid, and gas. But believe me, really, there is heaps of oil. I mean, we're so heavily reliant on Middle Eastern oil. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, the countries that export oil, basically consists of, what is it? It's Algeria, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran. If I'm correct, there's also Russia, then you've got Canada, then you've got Venezuela. If I'm correct, I think there's a few more, but those are basically the major oil producing and exporting countries. But a lot of oil, of course, today comes from the Middle East, but really there's heaps of oil. Think of the Sahara Desert, which used to be lush and green, all that dead vegetation, there'll be a lot of oil there. There's a lot of oil in the Australian desert. Oh my God, imagine how much oil would be in Antarctica. Antarctica, of course, now it's covered in ice, but the continent was actually green about 20 million years ago and before. With the movement of tectonic plates on the planet, Antarctica moved further south and then, of course, became very cold as it moved closer to the South Pole. But it used to be a green continent, and of course, a massive continent it was. Imagine how much oil would be in Antarctica. So there'll be a lot of oil in Antarctica, the Sahara Desert, throughout Russia, across the Americas, you name it, even under the sea. Parts of the land which used to be above water and therefore which had, animals and plants, but which now have gone underwater, with rising sea levels and moving tectonic plates. Sea levels are always constantly rising and falling, usually with the coming and going ice ages. The Earth's orbit around the sun is not perfect, it wobbles a little bit. Sometimes the Earth is a little further away from the sun. It gets cold. We have an ice age. The ice, you have a lot of ice at the poles and the sea levels go down. Sometimes the Earth is a little closer to the sun. The ice melts. There's less ice at the poles, and the sea levels come up, which is basically where we are now, more or less. The ice in Greenland and in the Arctic, and of course in Antarctica, that's pretty much what's left over from the last ice age. But of course, usually there's some ice at the poles no matter what. But there used to be much more during the last ice age. I think ice covered a lot of the northern hemisphere during the last ice age, even Russia, Northern Europe, Canada, if I'm correct. So I know where I live, New Zealand. New Zealand used to be a huge continent, being going back, millions of years. A continent called Zealandia, a pretty big continent, about half the size of Australia. A lot of it went underwater. Of course, New Zealand, what is now above water, is what's left of it, going and up to the Chapman Islands. The Chapman Islands, which is far east of New Zealand, next to the international date line. I think they're still the first to see the sun rising. I think that's true. But the Chapman Islands and New Zealand all used to be on one large continent with land between them. Now it's ocean, because the land, I think, got stretched and it went underwater, and also sea levels rose over the last few 100,000 years. So there used to be a large continent, and of course the continent had, plants and animals, and there would be a lot of oil there as well. So if you really think about it, and you think of the history of the Earth and how old the Earth is and how long it's had life for, hundreds of millions, even billions of years, and how much of plant matter and animal matter would be there, and which is decomposed and becomes squashed and eventually turned into oil. Believe you me, around the world, even though it's a finite place, there's heaps of oil. There really is. There really is. We're always just scaremongered into thinking that there's so little. So I guess partly so we pay the higher price when it's, just thrown upon us, but usually that higher price, as mentioned, is for political reasons or sometimes war reasons, things like that. or corrupt oil producing nations, companies, and the like. But really, there's heaps of oil still. There's heaps of oil, believe me. But having said that, obviously the problem is there are two main problems with that. Even if there is heaps of oil, like you could be Australia and to think, there's enough oil in your desert, in your own territory, in your own country, there's enough oil to last you how long, even to export to other countries, which of course could be hugely valuable to your economy. Imagine becoming no longer having to rely on foreign oil, and on top of that, having plenty of oil to export to other countries. As Australia, you could become like the Middle East of this part of the world, exporting oil to New Zealand, the Pacific Islands, all of Southeast Asia, possibly even India and China, with all the oil you have just in your own country. But even though there's so much oil, there's heaps of oil, the two problems are one, extraction. Yes, because of you have to set up the extracting plants, and you have to extract oil and all the infrastructure going around it, and then of course transporting the oil from there to where you need to ship it to or where you want to take it to. So one is extraction, of course, with the Middle East, all those oil rigs are set up, aren't they? And we're used to them and they're in place and all the systems and processes are in place and we're just used to ordering it from them. So one is extraction, and two is, of course, climate change. I'm not saying that we should extract as much oil as possible. I'm not saying that, even though it sounds like that. All I'm saying is that, yes, it'll be a long term project. Good things take time. Yes, it'll cost money. Things that are worth doing always do cost money, but you have to look at the long term benefit. The payoff can still be huge. It can still pay for what your costs and even much, much more. So you make a profit. Yes, you have to commit to it. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it takes planning. Yes, it takes a lot of work, but it can pay off in time. It might be a long term or mid term prospect, but it can pay off, and ultimately, it's worth it, right? It's a bit like taking care of your health. You have to work very hard now, but it pays off later on, right? You know. So yes, there's heaps of oil, but one problem is extraction. Antarctica, it's very far away, and of course, it'll be very hard to extract the oil, especially having to drill through the ice. I don't think that's very practical, even considering think about how much oil would be there. But even then, I don't think it's very practical. But oil such as like in the Australian desert, throughout Russia, across the Americas, maybe even where Zealandia used to be, around New Zealand, there'll be deep sea oil drilling. And I know there's been opposition to that, but maybe that could be worth it, just depending on how you do it and again how you plan it. But yeah, that's one problem, of course, extraction and the investment you need to make into that to make it work. The second problem, like I said, is of course climate change. Now, I'm not saying we should extract as much oil as possible. What we need to do is balance things out. Obviously, to combat climate change, there's so many things you can do. Whether it's planting trees, whether it's setting up more windmills and wind farms and solar farms, renewable energies, whether it's converting to electric vehicles, whether it's of course cutting down on petrol vehicles. But what I'm saying is that even if you do extract more oil and export it, yes, obviously that'll add to the number of petrol cars on the road and, of course, the amount of pollution that comes out of it. But, for example, you could offset it another way. So, overall it works out. For example, even if you have more petrol cars, but then you have more renewable energies, so all your other energy usage is being generated from renewable sources. In the end, you can actually offset it, even though you're extracting more oil and you're having more petrol, diesel vehicles. But if you have more renewable energy for everything else, for domestic use, commercial use, through the grid, then you can still actually offset it. Even simply planting more trees, you can offset it as well. So that's what I'm saying. It is a bit of a problem. It's a real juggling act, but there's a lot of oil. Believe you me, as mentioned, there's a lot of oil. If you can extract it in the right way, and also so we're not so dependent on Middle Eastern oil and not so affected by these horrible wars that happen. Think about what's happening right now with the price of oil around the world. If you can extract it so there's more oil available all around the world, and if you can make it worth it, especially for consumers, and so if you can extract it better, and if you can make it so it doesn't have an overall negative impact on the environment, even though you're extracting more oil, but you're still investing more into clean renewable technologies at the same time, for example, so you offset the increase in emissions, then in the end it works, doesn't it? It works for you as a country, wherever you are, or works for the world, it works for your economy, it works for the environment, and therefore future generations. So something to think about, but really, believe you me, there's heaps of oil out there. Thank you.